You're watching ChillyBoy Productions. I'm Larry ChillyBoy Chilson, and this is a versus matchup. Game of Thrones versus House of the Dragon. Which season one did it better? Now, before we get into this video, make sure to go ahead and click that subscribe button down below so that you can chill with me on each and every one of my latest videos. We have just wrapped up the first season of the Game of Thrones prequel series, House of the Dragon, based on the book from George R.R. Martin, Fire and Blood. The series comes 3 years after Game of Thrones concluded, and while season 8 admittedly sends me spiraling into a real rage, even today, I started the show with season one, and that first season is what got me to be such a passionate A Song of Ice and Fire fan. I know some folks are going to cry, oh, don't compare, just let things live on their own, let them be their own thing. Look, when you have two series in the same universe, two different premiere seasons that actually play out quite similarly in a lot of ways, I think a comparison is only natural. At the end of the day, it's just my opinion. So if you don't want to hear a comparison, why'd you click on the video? Now, let it be said, I really enjoyed both of these debut seasons for each series. I already talked about how season one of Game of Thrones really got me hooked into this universe. I had never read the books before, I didn't really know anything about it, and was instantly drawn in and captivated. On the other hand, well, while I waited and waited and waited for a new book to shed light on a real ending for me, I caught up on pretty much all the material I could possibly consume. So, leading into House of the Dragon, I had already consumed all of the written material that I could possibly get my hands on, including the source material for the show. So, right off the bat, my perspective was already different heading in. But ultimately, who comes out on top? Which season got their series off to a better start? Well, let's go ahead and investigate. Game of Thrones kicked off this universe for HBO, and it did so in great fashion. With the relatively unknown cast outside of fantasy superstar Sean Bean, this series introduced a vast set of new characters, a brand new world to the larger audience. The promise of a fantasy story lying underneath, season one of Game of Thrones largely deals with the politics of Westeros and sends our main protagonist on somewhat of a mystery hunt. And of course, introduces the first Targaryen we are to meet, Daenerys and Viserys Targaryen. House of the Dragon dives deeper into the vast history of this conquering family of silver-haired dragon riders and tells us the story of the Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryen civil war that is often referenced in the main series. But season one serves as the bedrock. We don't even get to the official Dance of the Dragons. Instead, we lay all of the groundwork, set the stage, introduce the politics and the players. Let's kick off with the strengths both of these series bring to the table, starting with Game of Thrones. The biggest positive, the real big check mark when it comes to Game of Thrones season one, is that it's honestly one of the best book to screen adaptations I've ever seen. It is a very faithful adaptation to the first book, Game of Thrones, in A Song of Ice and Fire. It keeps all of the key elements. It maintains the overall atmosphere and story of George R.R. Martin's work while understanding the more peripherous elements that can be sparsed down. We really focus in on the major through line of that vast novel so that the series is able to tell pretty much the exact same story in in almost exact same fashion without losing any of the magic that the novel brings. In addition, since George R. R. Martin's novel is also told through character point of views, the series is actually also able to add on to the story being told on the page, giving us perspectives on characters that we just encounter through the written page. In the series, rather, they get more screen time, more motivation, and it leads to some of the most interesting scenes and dialogues in the entire first season, particularly when it comes to the characters of Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, and Lord Varys. The series also introduced a vast cast of very intriguing characters. When you're dealing with this many characters in a brand new world, they have to be interesting enough to hold the audience's attention, and the series more than delivers on that front. We're split off into all of these different storylines that both converge and separate out as we move along towards the season finale. The story is ripe and interesting. Each character has very interesting plot points going on as we work throughout the season. Of course, the main storyline follows King's Landing and Ned Stark trying to prove the parentage and solve the mystery of the Baratheon children once King Robert Baratheon dies. Then we have the story of the outcast Stark bastard Jon Snow, who elects to go to the wall to try to find some sort of family, some sort of place of acceptance, and to prove himself in the world that has so often beaten him down and made him feel second rate. We get Tyrion Lannister, another man with a chip on his shoulder, being a dwarf in this world that treats him like dirt, including his own father. Of course, the rest of the Stark clan separated between Winterfell and King's Landing as they try to navigate the treacherous politics that the Lannisters have brought to their door, as Catelyn Stark tries to solve the mystery of her son's attempted murders and this mysterious dagger and note that comes from her sister in the Eyrie. And then across the narrow sea, we have Daenerys Targaryen, a princess who has been on the run her entire life, now sold off and forced to marry a brute of a man in a more savage type of culture of the Dothraki. All of these major plot lines lead to more significant smaller plot lines throughout, and they endear us to these characters as we begin to grow with them. All of these plot lines have a character arc. Not only the main character in that story, the point of view person that we're really following, but most of the periphery characters as well. Everybody goes on a journey, everybody learns something or ends up in a vastly different place than where they began the series at. I think that structure is another big positive for Game of Thrones. It's a linear structure that builds and builds and builds upon itself. We have multiple mysteries playing out, some that interweave, others that stand alone. We have character arcs that find their full destination by episode 10, but leave room for more growth for that character if further seasons were to come down the line. It all ends with the final several episodes being high stakes, highly emotional, yes, but also highly gratifying. Season 1, episode 9, when Ned Stark is executed, is still one of the most iconic moments in the entire series. And it's so well earned, and you are so invested. And then it makes all of that even more satisfying when we get to episode 10 and Robb Stark is named King of the North. Once again, fully earned. And then we get Daenerys, who has come from a position of complete weakness, and she ends off the season literally with dragons. And it's just this majestic, awe inspiring moment to end the season on. And of course, the dialogue, the writing is tight, it's mostly concise, and it's all highly engaging. Really great dialogues between characters. Then we move to House of the Dragon. Now, first of all, the budget's higher. Right off the bat, this budget dwarfs Game of Thrones season 1 budget and they put it to great use. The costuming, the set designs, the dragons, the multitude of dragons we get on screen. The budget is in full effect, and it is an absolutely stunning show. While Game of Thrones was certainly confined to what they could really accomplish in creating a fantasy world, House of the Dragon takes the bedrock that the original series laid down and really just embellished it to a wonderful manner. The acting, fantastic. I would say just as good, and maybe in some circumstances, even better than the acting in Game of Thrones. Patty Considine, Emma D'Arcy, Millie Alcock, Olivia Cook, Matt Smith. This cast is stacked. And even when we get down to our younger actors, we have some great performances throughout, some emotional beats, some really convincing characters. Like Game of Thrones, we're also dealing with bastardism. Bastards really disrupting the line of inheritance and the line of succession, and somebody really trying to expose bastards being in line to inherit the Iron Throne. Now, it doesn't play out as a mystery like it does over in Game of Thrones. It's more or less just confirmed. Leads to this really tense political atmosphere that holds steady episode 1 all the way through to the last shot of the series. The political intrigue runs high when it comes to House of the Dragon because we're literally dealing with the immediate succession of the throne and an actual viable threat to an inheritance. I would say the entertainment factor is just there. The drama is really high when it comes to House of the Dragon. We're dealing with much more volatile characters by and large, much more dramatic by nature characters, and that leads to a lot more dramatic moments, some big set pieces, high entertainment value in each and every episode. Whereas Game of Thrones has that slow burn feel, really all the way throughout, so that we get big moments, but we get a lot of just political jockeying every single episode. House of the Dragon also has that political jockeying, but we don't go too long in any given time frame without something highly entertaining and heavily dramatic happening to spice everything up. And there's just more action in season 1 of House of the Dragon. We have dragons, full-grown dragons right from the beginning, and they definitely bring the fire and blood as you would hope for. But we even get more gruesome type of action set pieces throughout. What are the negatives for Game of Thrones that hold it back in this contest of comparison? In honesty, I don't have many negatives for season 1 for Game of Thrones. Yes, it is a little bit slow. It does take its time moving through this political intrigue. And for some, that might be a bit of a slog. It is not an action heavy first season of the show. It is much more dialogue and politics driven. And we even have fights that are literally cutaways in season 1, which certainly can be a bummer, especially when you're building and building and building to this big war, and then we cut away and don't see any of it. So it definitely rings true of an HBO excess first season for Game of Thrones, particularly when it comes to sex and nudity and sexual violence. They are on heavy display here when it comes to the first season. Now, some of that is certainly taken directly from the books and put to the screen. However, it's so frequent in the first season that it becomes hard to stomach and hard to watch. Not to mention, on top of the sexual violence, just the sexual content that is really shoehorned in. The most infamous of cases is Peter Baelish just exposition dumping over a prostitution scene, over a sex scene. A very strange and unnecessary choice. And in honesty, one of the laziest ways to depict exposition, certainly in those first early seasons of the show. It really stands out because it's so lazy in comparison to all the rest of the writing around it. And, well, in order to appeal to a wider audience, Game of Thrones season one really tried to dumb down, neuter the fantasy element of the show. Instead, you could watch season one and really think it's just another medieval drama, another medieval politics drama. Yes, we have dire wolves, but for this season, certainly, they just look like wolves or large dogs. We don't start seeing the magical elements until Daenerys' storyline starts to introduce them with the dark magic, and then, of course, the birthing of her dragons. Right here in season one, they already dilute a lot of the mystical and magical elements from the book that characters develop and further delve into as we move along. So it lays that precedent and bedrock early on that ultimately leads to a fantasy show largely downplaying its own fantasy elements. Now, when it comes to House of the Dragon, the big criticism I have is the way the story is formatted. Multiple times throughout this first season, we take large time jumps 10 years, 6 years, 3 years. There are very few episodes that don't have a time jump that take place between them as we move throughout season one of House of the Dragon. Now, of course, we're dealing with a much larger span of time with this season one than we were in Game of Thrones season one. However, it really takes away from characterization on so many of these characters. We are introduced to characters that are taken away that episode or the next episode without ever giving us a real good connection to them. And it really starts to manifest itself in the second half of season one, where we have some big character deaths, some characters that mean a lot to main characters here in the show, characters that we care about. But as an audience, we only kind of feel sympathy and are able to connect through the fact that we care for Rhaenyra, say. And that's really because those time jumps rob us of time spent with all of these different characters. Whereas Game of Thrones has this huge cast, they're not afraid to put them all on the screen and have you just learn about them and grow with them. House of the Dragon has a large cast, though not nearly as large as season one for Game of Thrones. Yet we're only able to really identify with and kind of gravitate toward a few characters in the story who are present throughout the entirety of the runtime. It also kind of takes away from us getting to grow with these characters because they're recast about halfway through the season. You don't really get to grow with the actors and get that sense that you're literally growing older with these little characters we met in episode one and see how far they've come by episode 10. The time jump also robbed us of a lot of that political intrigue. We have these big moments at the end of an episode, and then when we start the next episode, it's been several years. So we don't get to see the direct fallout of those events. In many cases, the season by and large feels a little bit rushed. It feels weird to say that because I know everybody was just so excited to get to the Dance of the Dragons, the main event, the Civil War. But at the end of it all, if you really were so desperate to just get to that, most of what you have in season one could have been a prologue at the beginning, like we did with the Great Council, or you're just going to have to wait until season two to get into some of these other elements and let season one breathe a little bit more. I think it needed more time to breathe. And I have to say it, it's not as faithful to its book counterpart. And I say that mostly in its intention. And that feels weird because George worked on both of these. However, House of the Dragon deviates from its book source material in ways that are more perplexing than the deviations we get in Game of Thrones. Because it leaves some magical stuff out, and of course, parses the material down. But what it adds aren't actual events, but rather just like small conversations to fill in more of that story we're missing. Whereas House of the Dragon add in full on events like a dragon bursting through the floorboards and into the war that could have been. Also changed almost all of the character deaths in season one, some for the better, some make it a little bit more questionable. And a big complaint I personally have with season one of House of the Dragon is that it kind of took the bite out of a lot of our characters. By making the changes that they do here in the first season, they take away some autonomy of these main characters we have, particularly Rhaenyra and Alicent, even Aemond Targaryen, all have key moments to their story in season one altered to make them a little bit more gray, or in Rhaenyra's case, make her a little bit more heroic, period. So the changes made to House of the Dragon season one are more integral to the characters and the overall story that's being told. And in my humble opinion, it kind of waters down the overall story that was being told across the first season. In the end, I loved both Game of Thrones season one and House of the Dragon season one. One introduced me to the world that I love so much, and one reinvigorated a love that got butchered in the final season of Game of Thrones. It reignited my fire for Westeros and A Song of Ice and Fire once more. But ultimately, I have to say, while I enjoyed House of the Dragon season one, for me, Game of Thrones season one still reigns supreme. It stays so close to the amazing source material. Almost all of the changes they make, almost everything they add is an actual enhancement, other than that Peter Baelish scene. Takes the time to let us get to know these characters and become emotionally invested in all of these people and their stories. Ultimately, that's what got me hooked into this universe, is being so hooked on these characters and what was happening to them. The emotional payoff in episodes 9 and 10 hit harder than anything in House of the Dragon season 1. We have some treachery and murder and violence going on over here with the Targaryens, but the deaths and the triumphs that take place in those final episodes and those final moments in season 1 ring more true because of the investment they make throughout. When it comes to kicking off a series, Game of Thrones season 1 still reigns supreme for me. But I want to hear your thoughts. Sound off in the comment section below. Which do you think did it better? House of the Dragon season 1 or Game of Thrones season 1? Let me know your thoughts and your votes in the comment section down below, or you can hit me up on Twitter. If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button down below as well, and subscribe to the channel so that you are always up to date on all of my latest videos. I love you all so much for your continued support. Mwah! Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.